Hello, and thanks for tuning in to this presentation from the Next Level Executive. I am Perrin Desports, the founder of Next Level Executive, an executive coaching and professional development program where I help healthcare professionals build and lead financially rewarding group practices. I've spent the better part of 3 decades now building, operating, and growing businesses for Patterson Dental Company, as well as launching, operating, and successfully exiting two startups in Tusk Partners and Polaris Healthcare Partners. Both of those startups were focused exclusively in the group dental practice space. We provided consulting resources for entrepreneurs who were building group practices, helping them grow the business. And we provided transactional services for those who are looking to either scale with debt service or exit outright to an equity buyer. One of the questions that that I get all too often is, should I build a group practice? I think everyone who has a successful practice, be it a dental practice or otherwise, is contemplating what's next. Should I continue to add locations? Should I build a business for sale? Should I build a business for cash flow? What's involved with it? And all too often, those questions aren't answered by the practice owner. And if they do have some semblance of an answer, they probably don't have the full answer. Building a group practice is not for the faint of heart. It's incredibly challenging. It's fraught with danger. And if not done correctly, the founder can have irrational expectations of what the outcome looks like, and they can have completely irrational expectations of what the journey looks like. In this presentation, I'm going to take you through a handful of all of the above. So, I think the first thing that happens is that a dentist or other healthcare professional builds a successful practice. They are a clinician who owns a practice. The practice is stable, typically has good people working for it with some tenure, has systems and processes that create relatively predictable results. And the practice owner is typically generating a healthy degree of personal income. Healthcare practices, be they dentistry or otherwise, tend to lend themselves to Groundhog Day. This is where the practice owner experiences essentially the same day over and over again. And if you're creating a certain level of income, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but boredom typically results. And when people get bored, they tend to make bad decisions. So when the practice reaches some level of sustainability and financial success, the question for the practice owner becomes, how viable is that level of financial success into the future if we're looking out 5 to 10 to 20 years or more? Can we sustain that same level of success indefinitely? Or could potentially something go wrong? Or is it the appropriate time to try to continue some pattern of growth? We call this an inflection point. It's literally where the curve on the graph starts to flatten out, and it either continues to stay flat or it inflects and moves in an upward trajectory, or in the worst case scenario, it turns in a downward arc. So if that is us owning our own practice, what are some of the outside influences, some of the threats, some of the competitive pressures that would create a downturn? Can we control any of them? Can we prepare for any of them? And if something unfortunate or threatening were to happen to the business, what's our plan B? If it's the same as our plan A, then you really do have to think about how long, indefinitely, can you sustain your current level of success, be it for the next decade or thereafter. And this is really relevant because people start to ask themselves, first and foremost, or at least they should, can I afford to remain where I am? And when we look at a dental practice or a small healthcare practice, there's revenue and expenses, right? And when we think about revenue, how do we continue to grow revenue in a practice? You can hopefully influence insurance reimbursement rates, hopefully positively, but in a solo practice, that's kind of challenging. You could expand days and hours and capacity. You could also start to expand some of the clinical services that you provide, more complicated, more comprehensive treatment. On the expense side of the equation, we're staring at things like wages and benefits, and good Lord, those have all escalated at a pretty fast clip over the past couple of years. And that's born out of the headcount that we have in the business, obviously, the people working for us. The cost of lab and supplies, making some level of investment in marketing for new services and new patients that would yield a higher level of revenue, hopefully, and also reinvesting in some level of continuing clinical education that would allow us to expand the treatment envelope of the business. That typically requires some level of investment in technology as well. When we think about all of this from a solo versus a group practice context, and we try to look at the main levers, the main growth opportunities for revenue or reduction opportunities as it relates to expenses, this tends to take on a little bit of a different outlook and a different shape altogether for a solo practice versus a group. And you can see that, the in the world of dentistry, at least, insurance reimbursement rates for traditional solo practices have been on the decline for quite a while now, well over a decade. And I don't think there's any hope of that rebounding anytime soon. If you're a solo practice and you want to expand days and hours, that usually means that the owner has to work more days and hours, and that's not typically the best outcome for him or her. Expanding clinical services is a possibility, but it does typically require some level of reimbursement or reinvestment in the business, excuse me. And then on the expense side of the ledger, it's tough to make headcount reductions or wage reductions in a practice without replacing people. And you really don't have a lot of people to replace to begin with. Cost of supplies, lab is really born out of some level of bargaining power. And in a solo practice, you don't have as much as you do in a group. Reinvesting in marketing is a great opportunity, but it comes out of the owner's back pocket, as does reinvesting in continuing education and technology. So all of that is challenging in a solo practice context, but in a group practice, it takes on a little bit of a different look and shape to it because there's typically more available dollars for reinvestment. There's also more available opportunity to hire associates and expand days and hours. So what we typically see is that those who have a successful practice reach inevitably some level of stagnation. And if they have a decade or more ahead of them to work, you start thinking that, okay, the income that I'm deriving from my practice is great, but can I sustain that for a decade unabated? And that, from a competitive strategy standpoint, is a challenging proposition. And a lot of people think about simply adding additional locations from a standpoint of de-risking the position, their position in the current practice. If you've built a successful practice that is 100% dependent upon your clinical skill set for its existence, that's great in some respects because you control everything. It's really threatening in other respects because you are the key catalyst to all revenue, all profitability, and all personal income in the future. When you start to add additional locations, you can typically add additional associates and derive some level of passive income and move through that inflection point to the next growth opportunity on the curve as it relates to adding additional locations, maybe in a methodical manner. And obviously, if you want to take this thing to some level of growth and scale and really build an enterprise level business, you can do that too, but there's a lot more risk, a lot more complexity involved with it. So when we think about inflection points and time horizon, and people ask me, Perrin, should I consider building a group practice? My answer is it's relative to the amount of time ahead of you. And if you are 5 years or so from retirement, I don't think it's worth the risk to do that. On the other hand, if you've got 10 to 20 years or more ahead of you to work, I think it's kind of a gut check time. And I think it's something that you need to consider because it's becoming incredibly challenging to own and operate a small business of any sort And a solo practice is no different than that. Sometimes adding additional locations methodically and I would say predictably with some degree of control can be a good strategy to build a business that's not 100% dependent upon you. So the key question here is when you're at that particular inflection point, you have to ask yourself, if we're having this conversation 3 to 5 years down the road, what does success look like for me personally and professionally? It's all but impossible to draw a distinction between ourselves as business owners, as the key revenue driver of the business, and as spouses, parents, a family member, because though all too often the family side of the equation and the professional side of the equation are really intertwined, and you really need to balance both of them as you're considering some degree of growth strategy into the future. You can't, for all intents and purposes, separate them. So, asking yourself that question, I would just say be thorough about it and be decisive about it. Here are a couple of points to consider. If you are going to build a multi-location group, are you interested in building it for income purposes, meaning cash flow, or wealth? Is this a business that you intend to transact or operate? In other words, income and wealth are competing interests in a group practice, and they are not the same thing. What's the amount of time you're going to give yourself to build it, and how much effort, be honest about that, are you willing to put in? How much of a stress level are you willing to take on in terms of an increase beyond what you are right now? If you have a successful practice and there is some level of Groundhog Day to it, that may get boring, but you probably don't have a tremendous amount of stress. I can guarantee you that you will have much more stress, exponentially more, in a multi-location group. How much debt are you comfortable personally guaranteeing into the future? You're going to be personally guaranteeing any and every loan to buy or build additional locations, so get ready for it. What about managing and dealing with employees? It stands to reason that if you're going to have multiple locations, you're going to have more people working in those businesses. There's a greater degree of complexity, a greater degree of hassle and challenge, if you will, and you need to be ready for that. What do you want your primary role and responsibility to be? It, it's quite all right to be a full-time clinician and own a multi-location group, or do you want to be a part-time clinician and a part-time CEO, for example? What do you want your primary responsibilities to be? To find more locations to acquire or to recruit and develop young associates? It's tough to do all that from, behind the chair if you're working full time. So think through what you want your primary role and responsibility to be. How fast are you going to build this thing? Is it you're going to acquire one location every year for the next decade, or is it that you're going to acquire one location every 5 years for the next 10 to 15 years? Those are completely different businesses, and they have obviously a different degree of risk involved with it. What are you personally really great at, and what do you love doing? And at the same time, what are you not very good at, and what do you hate doing? How much control do you feel like you need to have when you are the dominant or primary business owner? And are you willing to give up some degree of control along the way? That's a question that most people don't ask themselves, and it's a pretty heady one because you probably own your business 100% right now. So the key decision points here are really what, why, and how fast. What are you trying to build? Why do you want to build it? And how fast do you intend to do it? Decision point number one, what are you trying to build? Is it 10 6 operatory practices, or is it 4 15 operatory practices? That's about the same number of operatories, obviously. It's probably roughly a similar amount of revenue overall, but those are completely different businesses. Think through what it is that you're trying to build. Is it going to be single focus, or is it going to be multi-specialty? Are you going to own 100% of the business? Are you going to bring in some equal partners to you, allow them to buy in or earn in? Or are you going to have multiple minority partners, probably associates who buy in or earn in along the way at some point? And are you going to take it so far that you want to start to centralize your administrative services, build a fully functioning MSO or DSO along the way? Why are you trying to build this thing? Are you, like I said before, interested in creating some level of wealth, meaning a transaction, or is it passive income? If it's wealth, meaning a transaction, you're probably going to reinvest a lot of the distributable income, the cash proceeds left over, back into the business for growth purposes. If that's the case, what's your margin for error at home? Do you have one? Or are your personal living expenses 100% of the income level you're deriving from the business, in which case you have no margin for error at home? Um, a faster business, faster growth ramp for a business is maybe one that'll create greater wealth and value upon exit, but it's really, really challenging to build. On the other hand, there are a lot of people now that aren't interested in transacting the group. They're simply interested in building a cash flow business for operations indefinitely. It's a more of a lifestyle business, I would say. And, this is maybe even an alternative investment vehicle to some of your diversified portfolio of investment right now. It's a slower growth ramp and potentially less value upon exit, but also less stress along the way too. Decision point number three, how fast until you get there? And what do you want your primary role to be? Clinician or CEO, director of business development? You're going to be in charge of recruiting, all of the above. Those are all the hats that you own right now, and you probably will have them for a while. What's the level of stress and workload that you really want to take on for this business? That's more of a personal type of a criteria. Again, how much debt do you want to take on to build this thing, and what's your horizon? Is it 5 years, or is it 10 or 20 or more? How long are you going to allow yourself until you get there? And is that time frame realistic? So let's think real quick about your entrepreneurial journey in and of itself. You know, we call this the entrepreneurial journey pyramid for a reason, because the bigger the business is that you build, is the more certainly more complicated it is, and to a degree, the more problematic it is. And I would say that your journey along the way of building the business takes on a lot of different shapes and sizes and a lot of different demands on you. So when we're thinking about that journey, we think about it from a financial focus and a personal focus. At the bottom of the pyramid, the base of the pyramid, you're focused on clinical and interpersonal skills, getting people to accept the treatment that you propose, and the practice that you have has some level of successful systems, operations, and basic operating principles. This is a business where you're interested in your personal status, being a great clinician, being a great dentist, and you are the technician, as Michael Gerber says in his great book about the E myth. The technician means you are the person performing the craft. You own the business, but without you, the business doesn't go. This is a business that you're focused on creating a level of direct income for you and your family to suit the consumption purposes that you all have and the income needs that you need. As you start to add additional locations, it's important for you to embrace that now this is a business that is no longer dependent upon you. You can't be everywhere at once. It has a degree of expansion to it, multiple locations, and it places more of a burden and a focus on your business skills to build some level of control across multiple locations and replicate some level of culture. You're looking for stability in that organization, and your role is more akin to a manager at this point. This is probably a business that creates some level of passive income that funds a lifestyle for you and your family. And then if you want to take it to some degree larger than that, you're probably operating at a faster clip, meaning a lot more speed and a lot greater scale. You're focused on a higher degree of execution with probably some type of an exit in mind. And this is really a growth journey that places a burden and a focus on you as the leader of the business, arguably it's a business built for valuation and an exit and a wealth changing opportunity for you and your family. Obviously, the financial risk and reward migrates from low to high along the way, as does the level of complexity based around people. And this is that entrepreneurial journey that we see very often and how people grow and scale the business they have as well as themselves as the key catalyst to it. So let's take a quick look at what success looks like in a solo practice versus a group practice. And if I go back to my Patterson days, we used to judge successful businesses to be those that generated about $250,000 in revenue per operatory. And those that did so were considered to be pretty successful. If you think about a six operatory practice generating about $1.5 million in collections, that's pretty good business overall, about two times the ADA average. So we say that that's a pretty successful business. But when we think about that same six op million and a half in collections type of a business, if I said, well, yeah, it's got six operatories, yeah, it has about 1.5 million in collections, but I'm open 7 days a week from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. All of a sudden, you don't start to see that quite as successfully as you did before if you were thinking that it was a typical 4 day a week type of a practice. And we built a something called a scalability framework in my time at Polaris. And when you're judging success in a group practice, you're focused on some different metrics. One is utilization rate. Utilization rate is a measure of revenue per chair per hour. It's a more accurate representation of the fixed, taking advantage of the fixed costs of the business and the days and hours that it's open. Also, in a group practice context, you're looking at more of an EBITDA margin, which is normalized cash flow. And in a general dentistry construct, on the low end, we're looking for something in the high teens, around 18% to around maybe mid 20s, 25%. And when we start to look at the framework, not on a revenue per op standpoint, but on a utilization rate compared with an EBITDA margin, we start to gauge success and failure a little bit differently. And when we look at businesses in a general dentistry context, the utilization rate, low end about $125 per chair per hour, on the high end about $175 per chair per hour. When we look at group practices that are generating on the lower end of that scale and the lower end of the EBITDA range I was mentioning before, that's probably a business that's not growing very much, and it's not generating the level of normalized cash flow that would be arguably very sustainable. It's probably something akin to a pending failure. A lot of times, I would see that there are practices or groups that are generating on the higher end of the utilization rate scale, $175 per chair per hour, but still yielding low EBITDA margin. This is what I call a treadmill business because you're really chasing revenue. You're not putting a lot to the bottom line, and arguably you're not creating enough normalized cash flow for reinvestment for future growth beyond a short-term perspective. Occasionally, I would see group practices that were high EBITDA margin but low on utilization rate. This is an interesting business because they're not really generating a lot on the top end in terms of revenue generation, but they've got the business leaned out as much as they possibly can to maximize the profitability of it. Think you're kind of living on borrowed time because you're not generating a whole lot of growth in terms of revenue. And obviously, the proven operators that we were fortunate enough to work with and those that we were able to coach and consult with over the years that could do both generate high utilization rate and generate higher on the EBITDA margin scale were those that would be proven operators. And this type of a matrix is very different in a group practice than what you would typically see in a traditional solo practice. So there are a couple of primary challenges. There are a lot of challenges to building a successful group practice. I'm going to go through three of them here in a little bit rapid fashion. The first, these challenges, I will also say, are the ones that we saw people making the same mistakes over and over again. Um, they are avoidable. They're to a degree predictable, and nobody tends to think about them until they have borrowed the money to buy or build their first additional practice. And I would say that you start to get into trouble really, really quickly when you borrow money from a bank because the bank is going to get paid back. You may not. So these three are probably the largest challenges that I experienced working with clients in terms of building a group practice. The first is that transition from clinician to CEO. Leaders of all businesses make sacrifices. And if you're going to build a group practice, it goes without saying that somebody has to lead it, and that someone is probably going to be the founder. You can't grow and lead a multi-location group if you're working a full-time clinical load and performing clinical dentistry 4 to 5 days a week. So the dirty little secret to this is that every entrepreneur who builds a group practice takes a personal income hit to do it. The question really becomes how much of an income hit and how long is it going to last? So the way we want to think about this is really thinking first on the home front. How much margin for error do we have at home? And what I mean by that is what are our personal living expenses? Look, none of us do what we do for free, and everybody likes making more money than less. And if we make more money, we probably spend a lot of it. That's okay. I'm not casting any judgment about that. But if your personal living standards are at 100% of the income level you draw out of your practice, then you don't have any margin for error on the home front. Your practice is literally an ATM that's funding your lifestyle. And if you had to keep some of the money in the business or reinvest it in an associate, then that creates challenges on the home front and puts you at odds with your family. And that's a really, really bad position to be in. So, how quickly do you want to transition away from the chair? When you do that, the clinical work, the clinical demands don't go away. You've just got to pay somebody else to do the work that you're no longer doing. So, how much of an income hit can you afford to take? And what is the marginal impact on the business that you have to make to offset that income hit? This is a lot of math. It's a number you can solve for, but it's alarming to me the fact that nobody does the math or thinks about this ahead of time. I coined the phrase the founder's dilemma because that's exactly what this is. This is taken from a model that we had built at Polaris for a client, and I whitewashed some of the numbers to make it easy. But this was a practice generating about 2.5 million in total collections. Of that, about 80% was clinical collections, doctor collections. And of the 2 million in doctor collections, the founder or owner of the practice was generating about 1.2 out of the 2 million. The business was running about a 60% overhead rate overall. And the owner was working 4 days a week clinically at the start of this journey. He wanted to transition down from 4 to 1 day a week clinically so that he could work on more business development and leadership opportunities, paying his associate 30% of what she collected as a clinical compensation rate. All right. So he makes up the majority of the clinical collections, and obviously in a general dentistry practice, doctor collections make up the majority of the total collections of the business. And his transition was, how quickly can I transition from 4 days a week down to one? When we look at this from an entrepreneurial aspect, and we see that our client was generating about 1.2 million in collections, and his associate was generating the other 800,000 in collections. We see that when we normalize his clinical compensation, meaning we apply a 30% collection rate to the 1.2 million in collections that he was generating, his clinical compensation attributed was about $360,000. Total income for him was about 750,000 a year, meaning that he made about $400,000 in entrepreneurial profit in the business. Didn't look at it that way initially. He just said, "Hey, I make about 750 grand a year." The way we look at it is how much does it cost you to replace yourself in a clinical capacity, and whatever is left over is entrepreneurial profit. So now we start running some numbers and we say if he's working 4 days a week clinically and wants to drop from 4 to 3 days a week, what's the negative impact on that? We're just dropping 1 day a week clinically, but you can see that when he does, his attributed collections drop from about 1.2 million to about 900,000. And in this situation, the $300,000 worth of clinical collections doesn't just magically disappear. The associate has to, or several associates, have to step in and pick up that level of collections. The work doesn't go away. But when he is now paying somebody to do the work that he's no longer doing, the attributed owner clinical compensation drops by about $90,000. The profitability, hopefully, of the business remains the same, but his personal income drops from about 760 down to about $670,000, about a $90,000 hit. You can do the math pretty quickly and imagine what this looks like when you drop from 4 days a week down to two. Again, owner collections drop and the income drops accordingly. Personal income takes a hit thereafter. And to go from 4 days a week down to 1 day a week, you can see what that does on a personal level of income. So I kind of laid out all of this for him to say, okay, how prepared are you for this transition? Is it prudent to go from 4 days a week down to one right away, or should we stair step this down over some period of time? You can imagine what the response was to that. And this is one where we want to start to think about ways that he could make an impact in the business to offset some of that income that he was now going to be paying an associate to replace him in a clinical capacity. So when we think about it in a worst case scenario, to go down to 1 day a week clinically, you're only deriving about 300, or you're only generating about $300,000 worth of collections, about $90,000 worth of income. If you want to keep your personal income level at the same as what it was when you were working 4 days a week, that means you have to make a pretty dramatic impact on the business overall to grow the entrepreneurial profit in it to keep your level of personal income whole. And when we think about it from a revenue generation standpoint, and we solve for the revenue needed to generate that level of entrepreneurial profit, it's a pretty massive increase. This was a business that was generating about 2.5 million in revenue. To go from 2.5 million to over 4 million in revenue is a pretty tall ask. You can also focus on the margin side of it, clean up some of the expense structure, increase some efficiencies and the like. And if you could grow the business from a 16% margin to about a 22% margin, it does lower the revenue number that you need to achieve. But even going from 2.5 million to about 3 to 3.1 is a 20% increase. And that's a pretty tall ask. So we think about how this level of personal income shifts in terms of clinical compensation versus CEO compensation to try to think about the impact we need to make on the business as our role is changing. Obviously, this is a gradual it should be a gradual type of a transition. You want to gain clarity around those initial steps, and you also want to be able to calculate accurately the level of clinical income that you're making from clinical services rendered and how quickly or slowly we can afford to drop a day a week of clinical collections. The second challenge is that you never buy a business to maintain it. You only buy a business to improve it, and you absolutely have to be able to quantify your improvements. The big mistake that people make here is that they typically get excited. They're bored because their current practice is generating tremendous results for them, and they want to acquire another practice. They may overpay for the practice, but they don't understand the difference in valuation methodologies, multiple of EBITDA versus percentage of income, and they can't accurately calculate free cash flow after they acquire it. Furthermore, they fail to generate any level of revenue or profitability improvements in the business that they're about to acquire. And they have this symptom of how is it that I'm making less income now when I own four practices, for example, versus what I made when I only owned one? How is that possible? And I'll walk you through how that is not just possible, but a frequent outcome. So this is a Mickey Mouse example to illustrate the point. We've got a practice that we own. It generates $1 million in revenue. It's a general dentistry practice split 80-20, clinical to hygiene, running about a 60% overhead rate. We make about 400 grand out of the business, pay taxes on some amount of it. I'm just using 25% as a blended rate. There's no debt on this business, so we have free cash flow of about 300 grand for us and our family. Very basic example here. When we think about that business, that same business, generating $1 million, we think about ourselves as if we were an associate, and we start to rationalize the clinical compensation derived out of the business plus the entrepreneurial profit that yields that amount of owner income. Again, using a 30% clinical compensation rate just to illustrate the point here. Um, about 240,000 in clinical compensation, another 160 grand in entrepreneurial profit. Again, this is that same example, no debt service on it, so it's 300,000 in free cash flow. If we want to acquire a practice that looks and acts the exact same as the one we own, it generates about $1 million in revenue. Maybe it's listed for sale from a broker for about 80% of revenue or $800,000. But it has the same overhead rate as our current practice. This would be a business that generates about $160,000 worth of entrepreneurial profit, which is a close enough approximation of EBITDA. And this would be a business that would sell for $800,000 as a multiple of valuation, or as a multiple of revenue, excuse me, and about a 5 times EBITDA multiple. If we borrowed money from a bank to acquire this practice and we financed it at a 4% rate, I built this deck before rates escalated pretty quickly, obviously. It would cost us about 100 grand, $97,000 in annual debt service to buy it, meaning that we would pay some amount in taxes, some amount to the bank, and it would be in the black, but only marginally so as it relates to free cash flow. Well, when we want to, if we think that that's successful in the first practice we acquire, and we would like to start making further acquisitions, it probably means that our role is going to transition and we're going to stop being a full-time clinician. We're going to be a part-time clinician. We're going to have to employ another associate to work and backfill behind us. Maybe we'll go from 4 days a week down to two. And here is where an associate will pick up those other 2 days a week for us. We'll pay him or her 30% of what they collect, or about $120,000 in this example. But our personal income starts to drop because now we're paying somebody to do the work that we're no longer doing, just like I showed in the first challenge around building a group practice. But it lowers our owner income out of the business. We still have to pay some level of taxes on it, but we've acquired one practice, and our hope is that we can be equally successful in acquiring a second practice. So here's another $1 million revenue business. This one might be a more competitive acquisition. It might fetch 90% of revenue as a selling price. Maybe it's more competitive, maybe it's in a better area or whatever, but we have to pay up a little bit to get it. This business is also running a slightly higher overhead rate. Maybe it's inflated staff salaries or something like that. So the business generates less in terms of entrepreneurial profit. We have to borrow more money to buy it. And this is a scenario for the first time where the business is actually, the acquisition that we just made is actually in the red as it relates to free cash flow. So what do we want to do now? Well, we want to go out and buy a fourth, of course. But this time we're not going to buy the $1 million practice. We're going to look for something that might be akin to the ADA average. This is a business that might not value as highly because it's generating less revenue, or maybe it's in a less advantageous area of town or something like that. So it sells for a lower valuation multiple, and it's less dollars on us that we actually have to borrow to buy the business, but it's also running a higher overhead rate. And this is a business that generates even less in terms of entrepreneurial profit. Unknowingly, we have just acquired a practice for a lot higher EBITDA multiple, even though the dollar amount we purchase it for is a lot less. This is a business that we have to borrow less from the bank and pay them back less, but it further pushes us into the red, and it's a drag on the other two practices that are actually in the black. So, what exactly happened here? We had a good practice and a great life at the start. We acquired three more practices, brought on a couple of associates. This is a business that's generating about four times the amount of revenue, and it has four locations versus the one that we had before. But for us, in terms of business ownership, we actually took about a 30% hit to our personal income level. Due to the fact that these are less profitable, we have not been able to generate any revenue generation or cost containment out of the businesses. We simply bought them in an effort to maintain them, and the free cash flow after debt service is a lot less. And now we're indirectly working to pay back the bank. This is where we say income and wealth are competing interests when you're building a group. And obviously, you want to think through the personal income impacts around your growth strategy. You want to get accurate valuations of practices. You want to define the acquisition that you're looking to, or the type of practice that you're looking to acquire. And you certainly want to be able to quantify the improvements you intend to make along the way. Obviously, we have to accurately forecast free cash flow and debt service to understand the impact that it's going to make on us as it relates to the business owner. So clarity and action steps in this context are gaining clarity around valuation and free cash flow, like I mentioned, but really defining what you're looking for or what you're not looking for in a practice to acquire, and obviously quantifying potential areas of positive impact. The third challenge that we see most often is around associates. And if you're going to create stability in any group practice, you really do need to figure out how you're going to attract and arguably develop and retain associates for the long haul. If this is the number one problem of every group practice. If you can solve it, you will create stability. If you can't, you're going to be akin to a hamster on a wheel, and all along the way, you are going to be competing against professional recruiters of enterprise level DSOs. So here's what the coming years really kind of look like. They're going to be a lot of young dentists entering the workforce. And I think that's going to be an advantageous position to be in if you do want to build a group practice. The ADA's Health Policy Institute forecast that there are going to be a greater number of dentists entering the workforce per capita over about the next 15 years, from about 61.3 in 2025 to as much as 67 per 100,000 by the time we reach 2040. Of those graduating from dental school, the seniors graduating, 30% are mind ready to join a group practice or DSO, and that's up from about 12% only 5 years ago, according to the American Dental Education Association. And At last glance, those who are graduating with a phenomenal amount in what they call educational debt, almost $305,000, and this does not include specialty school or residency. And of course, it stands to reason that those who are entering their prime earning ages between 30 to 34 years old are fewer and fewer are owning their own practice, solo practice, from about 30% in 2011 down to about 20% around the time of the pandemic. So there's going to be a wave of opportunity to hire a lot of associates into the coming year. And that's why I say if you're going to build a group practice, you've got to solve this problem. It is the number one problem of every group practice. It doesn't matter if you're two locations or over 1,000 locations. there is something worth contemplating, and that is that to ask yourself if you'd rather be 100% owner of the business valued at $2 million or potentially an 80% owner of a business valued at $10 million. You don't have to own 100% of the business to maintain voting control of it. And I think that is one of the fallacies that plagues a lot of group practice owners in the early stages, because usually when associates are able to buy in or earn into businesses, it tends to stabilize the group, and those who are owners tend to stay longer. This is a 10-year projection that we ran for a client around an earned equity model called restricted stock units or restricted membership units. In a growing group practice, an earned equity model has a lot of merits based on the growth and improvement and valuation of the company that's substantially different than in a traditional solo practice methodology. Buy-ins may be equally valuable depending upon the business construct, but suffice to say, when you're building a multi-location group, you can have different advantages, different methodologies, different outcomes to create for associates in a growing business. And in this situation, our client started out being 100% owner of a business valued at about $9 million. And over about a 10-year period, his intent was to add one additional location each year and allow one additional associate to earn into the business based on the merits of their personal collections. And at the end of that 10-year projection, we projected that he would end up would no longer own 100% of the business. He would take dilution and end up only owning about 75% of the business. But the value of the stake that he held went from about 9 million to about 36 million based on this model that we put together. So he owns a slightly smaller piece of a much larger, more valuable pie and has a lot of minority owners along the way. So when we think about associates, we want to solve for certainty. You obviously want, as the founder of the business, want to maintain control. You want to understand what control provisions are, and there are several in a multi-owner business. Day-to-day decision-making control is centered around something called managing member, or you've heard it called managing partner in a law firm. Simple majority is a 51% vote. Super majority is typically in the 70 to 80% range on voting control. While associates want some degree of security as well, they want a seat at the table and feel like their voice is going to be heard. They want a stake in the future they're going to help you create, and they want to belong. They want a degree of stability and think that this may be the last business they ever work for. And when you can solve for certainty in their mind, that can often create a lot of stability and minimize some of the chaos in the business that you have. So gaining clarity around your biggest challenge, which is attracting and retaining associates, is obviously mission critical. And deciding for yourself, do you want to keep it small and keep it all, meaning own 100% of the business, or are you okay with owning a slightly smaller piece of a much larger pie? Next Level Executive is a coaching program for people who want to become more effective executives and potentially build a group practice. All of my work over the last decade has been in the group practice space, and I've seen a lot of great outcomes and I've seen a lot of challenges. And distilling all of that wisdom and experience, both through my personal and professional career, as well as working with many entrepreneurs building group practices, has allowed me to build this coaching program where people who have mastered, I would say, practice ownership and have developed a great degree of clinical mastery are now wondering what's next. And this executive coaching program is one that I guide entrepreneurs to learn the ins and outs, the merits, the challenges, and everything along the way with building a group practice and really improve your business acumen over the course of about a 12-month run. If you would like to learn more about the Next Level Executive, you can see my contact information there, email address, Perrin at thenextlevelexecutive.com, as well as my cell phone number, You can find out more about who I am and what I do on the website, thenextlevelexecutive.com. And if you like subscribing to podcasts, mine is called The Next Level Executive. I help healthcare professionals build and lead financially rewarding group practices. Thanks so much for taking a second or an hour to look at this presentation. I hope you learned something along the way of the entrepreneurial journey. And even if you're not interested in building a group practice, but you are interested in becoming a more effective executive, I hope you'll consider joining us in the Next Level Executive program. Thanks so much for your time.